If you've been with us for the last about month or two, we've been in a series called From the Beginning. And the purpose of the series is to help continue to open our eyes and our hearts to this reality that Jesus has been a part of the story from the very beginning, from creation and speaking creation into this world. All the Old Testament, again and again, will continue to point towards Jesus, reveal Jesus, and foreshadow him. That's what this series has been about. Last week, we were introduced to a husband and wife, a man named Abram and his wife Sarai. They will later be called Abraham and Sarah because the Bible likes being a little confusing, right, Leslie? They changed names on us for some reason because it's not hard enough. We were talking about this. But that's, if you've heard Abraham, same guy, same person. But we met them last week. And in Genesis 12, we knew very little about who these two people were. In fact, the only thing that we learned about Abram and Sarai were that they were married. They were older in age. They were in their late 70s, and they were unable to have kids. And so that was a story we got, that season of being able to conceive had passed them. And yet God comes to Abram and makes this incredible promise to him. And he says, Abram, you're going to have an heir. You're going to have a son. And not just that, he's going to have children and on and on and on through the generations. So it's not just that you're going to have a son, you're actually going to become a great nation. And we will learn later that nation that God is referring to will become the nation of Israel. And so God makes this promise to Abram and is then calling Abram to begin walking out in faith. He goes, Abram, come forward, walk in faith, walk in trust in me. And he tells Abram to leave everything behind. Leave your country, leave your people, leave your household. He's saying, leave any place of comfort and security behind. And the reason God is telling him that is God knows what's true for Abram and what's true for you and I, is that as we start walking out in faith, the minute things get difficult, the minute things don't make sense, the minute things get hard, we're always going to revert back to places of safety and security, and we're going to step away from walking in faith with God. So the reason God is telling Abram to go and to leave is he's trying to untether Abram, because he wants Abram to know, I'm going to be your provider, I'm going to be your protector, I will be your security. Do you trust me, Abram? And Abram begins to walk forward. And God tells them, the reason I'm doing all of this, the purpose of this, is not just to give you a son. God's plans are far greater than we can imagine. God says the purpose of this is so that you will actually become a great nation, and the purpose of that nation is that it would be a blessing to the world. That was the purpose of what Abram was going to step forward into, that the nation of Israel was always meant to be a blessing to the world, a light to the world. And as other people saw this group of people, this community, this nation, and they saw how they worshiped their God and how they treated one another and how they treated others and the love of God flowing out of them back out into this world, that people would be drawn to that light. And so that's what Israel was supposed to be. And so Abram steps forward and begins walking in faith. And so this morning, we're going to pick up the story of Abram's life. We're going to continue it again next week. The reason we're spending 3 weeks on Abram is not only because of the significant things that happens between Abram and God that have implications for us still today, but what I love about Abram is he helps put life in words to something we all struggle with, which is this reality that we want to be people that walk in faith towards Jesus. We want to trust God and move towards him, and yet so often in our life, doubt creeps in, and uncertainty creeps in, and fear creeps in, and we find ourselves in this tension of trying to be people of faith, and yet the struggle is real. And we saw it last week, we'll see it this week, we'll see it next week, that Abram is living that tension of wanting to go forward with God, and yet all this doubt continues creeping in his head. So, that's all introduction. If you have a Bible and want to follow along, we are going to be in Genesis chapter 15. We're going to spend all morning, the next 20 minutes, in this section. Hours, my friends. In Genesis chapter 15, the verses will be on the screen. We have Bibles as well. If you don't have a Bible, right when you walked in, there is a Bible or two, so grab one now, grab one on your way out. We'd love for you to have a Bible. But here is where we're picking up the story. It says, after this, Genesis 15:1, after this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram says, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. See, the reality from that promise that God makes to Abram in Genesis chapter 12 to now where we are in the story, 10 years have passed. 10 years since God spoke that into his life. And you just have to imagine what Abram and Sarah were going through, right? They had walked away from that season of life. God gives them this incredible promise, and now a decade has passed. And so you see the doubt creeping back into Abram's life, and he's beginning to kind of hedge his bets and kind of starting to make some other decisions. And God comes to him, and what I love is God comes and he speaks hope into that place of doubt. That's what God does. He knows that there's a place of doubt and hurt. And so God says, Abram, do not be afraid. I am your shield, your very great reward. God's going right to that spot. And then Abram comes back and says, Sovereign Lord. And so he's coming back humbly to God. And he's saying, I don't understand this. And what happened in that time is if you didn't have a son or if you didn't have a child, but mostly a son who would inherit your estate, what you would do once you got to an older age is you would take one of the eldest sons of one of your workers, one of your servants, and you would anoint them. And then they would inherit everything. And so Abram's like already starting to hedge, saying, well, obviously this person's going to inherit my estate. And he's also wondering, God, that promise you gave me, it's probably going this way, right? And on a macro level, what I love about this section is, and the Bible does this again and again, it gives us permission to come to God with our doubt, with our confusion, with our questions, with our fear. That the life of walking in faith doesn't mean we bury our head in the sand and we just blindly go towards God. No, what it means to be people who walk in faith, it means that we are people who have our eyes open and we move towards a God who is knowable and who seeks to know us. And a God that allows us and invites us to ask questions and to invite him into our struggle. That's where God wants to be. And so I love that about this moment. Abram's going to God saying, I don't get it. And God responds to Abram. It says, and the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. God gave him this promise. Doubt has crept in. It's been 10 years. Abram doesn't know what's going on. And so God, instead of punishing Abram for his lack of faith, continues to encourage Abram, saying, trust me. So he calls Abram to go outside and says, look at the stars. Look at all those stars in this night sky, in this country place, in this unknown area that Abram was in. He looks up. The sky is lit up with stars. And God says, start counting them. You can't, can you? That's how vast this nation will be. That's how deep your ancestors and the generations will go. And what God is trying to help Abram see is every time that doubt creeps in, look up at the sky and be reminded that the God who created this, that the God who speaks creation into existence, the God who put those stars in the sky is the same God whose promises are true. It may not make sense to you, it may not make sense to us, but you will have an heir and it'll be your own flesh and blood. And it says, Abram believed him. And then it says this phrase, and God credited to him as righteousness. And what that means is because of Abram's belief, he was made right with God. That's what that means. Abram believed in God's promise. And God says, that makes you right with me. Throughout the New Testament, all the writers point back to this moment, this verse, and says this is the place that shows us so clearly that the foundation of our faith is we are made right with God, not by our works, not by our achievements, not by our church attendance or how much of the Bible we have memorized. What makes us right before God is our belief in him. Do we believe in his promises? Do we believe that he is right? Do we believe that he is trustworthy? Abram believed, and God credited it to him as righteousness. He is made right with God because of his belief. The story continues. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? Abram asks about the promise God said that you will have an heir. And now he's asking about that promise of being a great nation. So to be a nation, you need people, right? You can't be a nation of one. You need children, a family, and that's how nations are built. And so that's the first thing you need to be a great nation. The second thing you need is a land. You can't be just all scattered everywhere. That's not a nation. A nation is a group of people that have their own place. So he's saying, all right, God, I believe you about my heirs, but we don't have a land. When's that promise going to come together? And so he asks God the question, and God responds and says this back to him, which is a little strange. He says, okay, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon, right? So problem solved for Abram. That all cool. So let's take a detour. These are the parts of the Bible that if you're not familiar with the Bible, or this is new to you, or the Old Testament is new to you, you're like, this is strange. This is why I get confused. You might be sitting here saying, Amen, every week I feel this way, but that's okay. We're with you. But let's take a little detour and talk about what's about to happen. What God is initiating with Abram's asking this question, how can I know? How can I know? And so God is initiating a covenant with Abram. And all covenant means, that word, it just means it's a binding promise. A covenant is a binding promise between two parties. I will do this and you will do this, and we agree to that, right? The most familiar covenant that many of us see and engage in our life now is the covenant of marriage. I mean, if you think about a marriage ceremony, that's what we are saying, and especially a Christian marriage ceremony, that I commit to this and I commit to this. That's the vows, right? Matt, Vanessa, you guys just did this? Yes? We commit, I do this, you do this. That is a covenant, that we are making a binding pledge. You will do this, I will do this. And in front of God and all these witnesses, that's what's going to confirm this covenant. In our life, there are all kinds of ways this happens, small ways, big ways. For the easiest one is sometimes we call it like a handshake deal or a verbal agreement that you agree and I agree and we're on the same page and thumbs up and we move on, right? The next layer is like if you've ever signed something like a contract, that when you got your job, your employer gave you this contract and you signed that contract saying, I agree that I'm going to do this work, I'm going to work these hours, and I'll accomplish these tasks, and I'll behave a certain way, whatever's in that, like you sign that, and then your employer signs it. And what are they pledging to do? What's their end of the bargain? I'll pay you. I'll pay you this, and I'll give you these benefits, and so you have that layer, right? So that's a deeper layer. And probably the biggest type of covenant in our lives that we may experience is if you've ever leased a car or rented an apartment or buy a house, or maybe you closed a big deal, and this is the one where you sign your name 17 times. You're like, I don't know what I'm signing anymore, but you just keep signing an initial and sign an initial, and there's a lawyer and there's a notary, and you're like, all of those layers are happening, right? That's the deepest level in our life of a kind of binding pledge. All of that was true thousands of years ago, but obviously without lawyers and paperwork and signatures and notaries, right? There were binding covenants that people would make with one another. And what's so amazing is God steps into that place and he begins making covenants with humanity. And just think about that for a second. That the God of the universe desires to connect with humanity, and God says, I'm going to make promises to you. God doesn't need to make promises with us. We're nothing, right? He's God. We're humans. But yet God, throughout the Bible, we'll see him make covenants with humanity. And it's just this reminder of God's desire for relationship and partnership with humanity, right? And so there are 5 major covenants that God makes with humanity. The first one you may have noticed was a couple weeks ago when Oscar preached, and he shared the story of Noah. That's one of the first covenants. And if you remember, at the end of that story, God comes to Noah and he makes a covenant with Noah. In Noah's end of the bargain, what he needs to do, God says, all right, since the population is gone, I need you and your family to repopulate this earth, to be fruitful and multiply, right? It was the same mandate given to Adam and Eve. God reaffirms it and says, this is your end of the covenant. This is your end of the bargain. And on God's end, what was he going to do? Well, he promised Noah and all of us that he will never flood the earth again. That no matter how evil humanity becomes, no matter how often they rebel or turn their back on me, no matter how far they are separated from me, I will never send a flood again. God says, I'm making that covenant with you, Noah. I'm making that pledge, that promise. And God goes a step further, that I want you to always be reminded of this moment, that God makes a covenant with humanity. And so he says, anytime you see a rainbow, you and your future generations, that rainbow is meant to represent and be a reminder that in Genesis chapter 9, God makes this covenant with humanity that he'll never flood the earth again. And I always like that covenant because you have to imagine the PTSD of the people when rain would start coming down, right? They're like, is it happening? But God's like, no, rain will come. We need rain. But then you will see the rainbow out of that, and you'll always be reminded God is good, God is faithful, God can be trustworthy. That's the first major covenant. We're going to look at the second one here in a moment. God makes a covenant with a man named Moses. He makes one with a king named David. And then in the New Testament, we see Jesus begin talking about a new covenant. We're going to look at that in a few weeks. So that's what a covenant is. And so when God is telling Abram to bring these animals, what God is actually enacting is the most serious, the deepest level of a covenant that God can make with humanity, or that humanity would make with each other back in this time, and it was a blood covenant. So we're going to begin reading about, well, what does a blood covenant look like? Are we all still good? Are we out there? Great. Alexa's taking notes, so you can look at her notes later. I love it. So Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, and Abram already knows what to do. He knows what a blood covenant is. This was somewhat common in this time, very serious but common. And so it says, Abram cut them in two and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half, so good for the birds. Then birds of prey, different birds, came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. So we'll pause there. What a blood covenant is you take these three animals, you cut them in half, you arrange them on opposite sides of each other. I know. If there's only a notary, we could have just solved all this very quickly. You arrange them next to each other, and what happens is the blood pools to the center, right? We can all picture that. Animals cut in half across from each other, blood pools in the center. And what a blood covenant is that it starts with the greater party. The greater party dictates the term. God is the greater party, right? So if you think of a contract, you as an employee, you don't write the contract for your boss. The boss gives you the greater party gives the contract. So God is setting the terms with Abram, saying we're going to go through a blood covenant. And what happens then is the greater party goes through first. And what they are saying, if I don't hold up my end of the bargain, then let what happened to these animals happen to me. Blood spilled, life lost, right? That's what a blood covenant is. If I don't hold up my end of the bargain. So these happened, but these were not common, right? They were more normal covenants. But this was the deepest type of covenant. Blood spilled in the middle, walk through it, and what you were saying is if I don't hold up my end, let what happened to these animals happen to me. And then the lesser party will go through, and the same thing, the same language, that if I don't hold up my end of the bargain, let what happened to these animals happen to me. And so God sets up this blood covenant. He's the greater party. What is God's obligation in this? What is he pledging? We saw it in Genesis 12. It is an heir, it is a land, and that Abram would be blessed. That's God's end of the bargain. This is what I'm going to do for you, Abram. You're going to have an heir, you're going to become a great nation, you will have land, and you will be blessed. That's his end. What is Abram's end of the bargain? What is he pledging and committing to? We catch a glimpse of it last week when God calls him to walk in faith and trust, right? So that's a piece of it, to walk in faith and trust. We get more revealed, actually, 2 chapters later in Genesis 17. Michelle has that verse on the screen. In Genesis 17, it says, when Abram was 99 years old, more time had passed, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully, okay, and be blameless. Uh-oh. Then I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. So what is Abram's end of the bargain? What is he pledging for him and his ancestors to walk faithfully with God? That for all of our generations, all of my children, grandchildren, all the way down the line, we will always walk faithfully with God. Maybe. The second part, and to be blameless. And to be blameless means you're without fault, you're without sin, you live a holy and pure and perfect life. Is Abram able to do that? No. Can any one of us do that? No. And yet that was Abram's end of the bargain. And so Abram cuts these animals, sets up this blood covenant. In verse 12, it says, as the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Most scholars agree that the two things happening right now for Abram, what is causing this dreadful darkness that's coming over him, is one, he is aware that he is about to enter into a blood covenant with the God of the universe, and his end of the bargain for him and his ancestors is to be blameless, to walk perfectly in faith and to live a perfect life. And so Abram's aware that he is about to walk through his death sentence, right? Let what happened to these animals happen to me and all our future generations if we can't live up to this. And so that's a part of this dread that's falling over Abram. The second thing that's happening is God's about to share with him and give him a vision, give him a picture of what's going to happen over the next several hundred years. And God starts describing this reality, that things are going to become difficult, that it's going to be hard, that there's going to be challenges. Yet what God is trying to help Abram understand is just because our walk of faith, that there are times of difficulty and pain and suffering, it does not mean God has abandoned you. It does not mean that God is away. God's promises are true and he will fulfill them. Challenges, suffering, pain in life does not mean the absence of God. So God is actually going to let Abram know, hey, this is what's going to happen. And so when it starts happening, you and your family and your ancestors will not lose faith. So it says in verse 13, then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. God is saying, I am doing a deep and great work in this world, and it's a reminder that our lives are not just about us, but God is doing far more than we can ever see or imagine. Sorry, bummer, but it's not just about me, not just about you. God's at work. And God's telling them, here's what's going to happen. And he's talking about events that are going to happen in about 200, 300 years from now. If you get to the end of Genesis chapter 50, and the next book, which is a book called Exodus, chapter 1, you're going to see this play out in a few hundred years. That God's people, the Israelites, Abram's line, is doing very, very well. They're living in Egypt. They're prospering. And we get to Exodus 1, and Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, he's not loving that they're prospering. They're starting to get nervous. Well, if they get too prosperous, they may take us over. So they begin acting out of fear, not trust. And so what Pharaoh says, let's enslave them. And they began enslaving them and mistreating them. The very exact same words God uses here is used in Exodus chapter 1. This is what's going to happen. So God tells Abram, it's going to be a little hard for a season. And yet after 400 years, they will be rescued out of that. And in Exodus chapter 3, we see after 400 years, God calls a man named Moses and uses Moses to rescue God's people out of Egypt, and they begin making their way across the desert to the promised land. Why is it called the promised land? Because this is literally the land that God had promised them. So God is telling them this is what's about to happen. And so what's supposed to happen next now? Well, now God's the greater party. The pledges are made. God's going to go through first, and then Abram's supposed to go through next. Let's see what actually happens. In verse 17, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and says, to your descendants, I will give this land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, to the land of the Kenites, and on and on and on. What was supposed to happen is God goes first and says, if I don't live up to my end of the bargain, what happened to these animals can happen to me, God. The second thing was Abram's supposed to go through. And the minute Abram goes through, he has sentenced himself and all his descendants to death. And yet what we see God do instead is first God goes through the greater party, and he is represented in a smoking firepot. And instead of somebody coming after the lesser party, something is alongside God, and it is a blazing torch, also a representation of God. A few hundred years from now, when God's people are making their way out of the desert in Exodus and towards the promised land, as they're going along at night and they're wondering, where is God? God appeared to them in a smoking torch, in a pillar of fire, and they would know, oh, God is guiding us, and God is with us, and God is protecting us, right? That same imagery. And so we see God in this moment go through twice. And what is that saying? God says, if I don't live up to my end, let what happened to these animals happen to me. And then he tells Abram, if you don't live up to your end, then let what happened to these animals happen to me. See, God takes that death sentence away from Abram and his descendants and humanity and you and me, and God puts it back on himself. And says, Abram, you will reap the benefits, I will pay the consequences. And our eyes can't help but be shifted to the cross. And we begin to get such a clearer and deeper picture of what happened in that moment. God's justice and God's mercy coming together. Because God is a God of promises, right? God doesn't lie. What God says is going to happen will happen. And even if that meant in that moment when God said, what happens to you, Abram, when you fail, I'm going to take that consequence on. That had to happen. Blood had to be shed. Life had to be lost. But instead of happening to Abram, God says it's going to happen to me. And so on that cross, we see Jesus and we recognize the justice of God on display, and yet we also see the mercy of God. That instead of humanity being the one to pay that price, God says, I'm taking it on myself. This is who God is. You will reap the benefits. I will pay the consequence for your rebellion and your sin again and again and again. And so what's so incredible for us is on that cross, we recognize that we are invited to receive the greatest promise that God can give humanity. And that is our salvation and our eternity, right? That's the greatest promise from God in our life. There's other promises, but the greatest promise that God gives us is our salvation and our eternity. And on the cross, when Jesus spilled his blood, what that did for us is for those of us who believe, in Jesus, for those of us who believe on what happened on that cross, God credits that to us as righteousness, right? That means we are made right before God because of what Jesus does on the cross. And so what's incredible, and our boy Paul reminds us of this again and again in the New Testament, he said, God sees you as holy and pure and blameless. That's the language Paul uses. You are holy and pure and blameless. Why? Because of what we did? No. Not because of what we did. Not because of what we did last week or last month or last year. No. We are not the ones who are holy and pure and blameless. But because of what Jesus has done, and his blood covers us, it makes us right before God, not because of our works, not because of all these great things we do, because we believe in him. And so in our lives, we are invited to step into the greatest promise God has. All right, the worship team back up. And so this morning, my hope for you as you're sitting here and you're processing all of this and this moment between God and Abram in Genesis 15 that has ripples that pour all the way through into the New Testament, into the life and death of Jesus, my hope for you is that you would be reminded of God's love and mercy. That maybe God's love and mercy would continue growing in your eyes and your heart when you see the reality of what God was willing to do for you and for me. That he knew there's no way Abram's going to be able to hold his end up of the promise, not even for a moment. We're going to see next week, man, it goes off the rails for Abram. And yet God is faithful. So my hope is as you continue worshiping and praying, that you would recognize God's love and mercy in our lives. And maybe for you, you're in that place and you're in that struggle of feeling that hopelessness. I mean, just think of that reality. 10 years had passed since Genesis chapter 12 to Genesis 15, and there's still no child. Abram's feeling it. His wife is feeling it. They're feeling this lack of hope. 400 years will go by, and God's people will be enslaved. And they would begin to lose hope, and they're crying out to God. And yet I hope that this story reminds us that God is faithful. That God is the God of promises, that God's promises are true. He hasn't left you, he hasn't abandoned you. That the walk of faith doesn't mean it is without, at times, suffering and pain and hardship. And even the promise that God gives us of eternity and salvation, well, that happens after our death, which isn't pretty. Walking in faith and walking with God doesn't mean there are not going to be difficult times, but suffering does not mean God is absent. And my hope is if you're in that season and you're in this struggle, that you would recognize that God invites us to come to him, that God desires to speak into those places in our life, and God invites you to come to him with your doubt, your questions, your anger, your fear, your confusion, because he calls us towards relationship. So let us continue worshiping with that in our hearts, and continue praying that God would meet us where we're at this morning. Let's worship.